The humid lowlands of the Gulf Coast of present-day Mexico, where dense vegetation presses against winding rivers and seasonal swamps, once sustained one of the earliest known complex societies in Mesoamerica. Long before the rise of the Maya or the expansion of Teotihuacan, the people now referred to as the Olmec established monumental centers, developed distinctive artistic traditions, and laid foundations that would resonate across centuries of cultural development in the region. Their civilization, which flourished roughly between 1500 and 400 BCE, has often been described as formative, not because it stood alone, but because many of its innovations appear to have influenced later societies in profound ways. The term Olmec itself, however, is not one the ancient inhabitants would have recognized. It derives from a much later Nahuatl word used by the Aztecs to describe people living in the same general region. Archaeologists adopted the term in the 20th century as a convenient label, though the true name these people used for themselves remains unknown. This gap in knowledge reflects a broader challenge in reconstructing Olmec history. Unlike later Mesoamerican civilizations, the Olmec left no clearly deciphered written records that can narrate their own story. Instead, understanding their rise and eventual decline depends on material evidence, architecture, sculpture, environmental data, and patterns of settlement. At the heart of Olmec civilization were several major centers, among them San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes. Each of these sites emerged at different times, suggesting not a single unified state but a sequence of regional developments, possibly connected through shared cultural practices and exchange networks. San Lorenzo, the earliest of these centers, rose to prominence around 1400 BC. Situated on a plateau surrounded by fertile floodplains, it occupied a strategic location that allowed for both agricultural productivity and control over local waterways. Excavations at San Lorenzo reveal a highly organized settlement, featuring artificial terraces, drainage systems, and carefully planned architecture. Massive basalt sculptures, including the well-known colossal heads, were transported over considerable distances, likely from the Tuxtla Mountains, indicating a capacity for coordinated labor and logistical planning. These heads, carved with individualized features, are often interpreted as representations of rulers or elite individuals, though their exact significance remains debated. What is clear is that they reflect a society capable of mobilizing resources on a large scale. The rise of San Lorenzo appears closely tied to environmental advantages. The surrounding region offered rich alluvial soils, suitable for cultivating staple crops such as maize, beans, and squash. Rivers provided both transportation routes and access to aquatic resources. Archaeological evidence suggests that the inhabitants modified their landscape extensively, redirecting water through canals and possibly managing seasonal flooding. Such interventions would have supported agricultural stability, allowing population growth and the emergence of social hierarchies. Yet even at this early stage, the Olmec world was not isolated. Artifacts found at San Lorenzo indicate long-distance exchange networks extending across Mesoamerica. Materials such as obsidian, jade, and serpentine were sourced from distant regions, implying interactions with communities far beyond the Gulf Coast. These exchanges were not merely economic. They likely facilitated the spread of ideas, iconography, and ritual practices. The Olmec artistic style, characterized by motifs such as war-jaguar figures and complex symbolic imagery, appears in various forms across other regions, suggesting a shared or at least widely recognized cultural language. By around 1200 BC, San Lorenzo reached its peak. Monumental constructions expanded, and the density of sculpture increased. However, this period of apparent prosperity was followed by a significant transformation. Archaeological layers indicate that many monuments were deliberately defaced, buried, or reworked. The reasons for this are not definitively known. Some scholars interpret these actions as evidence of internal upheaval, possibly linked to political instability or changes in leadership. Others suggest that ritual practices involving the recontextualization of monuments may account for the observed patterns. Around 900 BCE, San Lorenzo experienced a marked decline. Population levels decreased, and large-scale construction largely ceased. The center was not entirely abandoned, but it no longer held the dominant position it once had. The focus of Olmec activity shifted eastward to La Venta, located in what is now the state of Tabasco. This transition represents one of the key turning points in Olmec history and raises important questions about the factors driving change within the civilization. La Venta, which rose to prominence between approximately 900 and 400 BCE, presents a different kind of urban layout. Built on an island-like ridge within a swampy environment, the site features a central ceremonial complex dominated by a large earthen mound, often interpreted as one of the earliest pyramidal structures in Mesoamerica. Surrounding this central feature are plazas, altars, and a series of buried offerings composed of carefully arranged stones and figurines. The construction of La Venta suggests a high degree of planning and symbolic intent. The orientation of its structures appears to align with cosmological principles, possibly reflecting an understanding of cardinal directions and celestial patterns. Such alignments are not unique to the Olmec but are seen in later Mesoamerican societies as well, indicating a continuity of ritual and spatial organization. The artistic output at La Venta continues many of the themes established at San Lorenzo while introducing new variations. Colossal heads remain a prominent feature, though fewer in number. More elaborate relief carvings appear, depicting figures engaged in ritual activities, often emerging from or interacting with cave-like motifs. These images have been interpreted as representations of mythological narratives or cosmological beliefs, though without written records, their precise meanings remain open to interpretation. During the height of La Venta's influence, Olmec-style artifacts appear across a wide geographic area, from central Mexico to parts of present-day Guatemala. This distribution has led some scholars to propose that the Olmec functioned as a mother culture, spreading foundational elements to later civilizations. Others argue for a more nuanced model, suggesting that the Olmec were part of a broader network of interacting societies, each contributing to shared developments. The debate reflects broader questions about cultural diffusion and independent innovation in early Mesoamerica. While La Venta flourished, the environmental context of the Gulf Coast remained both a resource and a challenge. The region is characterized by heavy rainfall, shifting river courses, and periodic flooding. These conditions would have required ongoing adaptation. Evidence from sediment cores and geological studies indicates that environmental changes, including fluctuations in river systems, occurred during the period of Olmec occupation. Such changes may have influenced settlement patterns and agricultural practices, though their exact impact on societal stability is still under investigation. As the centuries progressed, La Venta maintained its prominence, but signs of transformation began to emerge. Construction activity appears to have slowed toward the later phases of occupation. Some monuments were again buried or repositioned, echoing patterns seen earlier at San Lorenzo. By around 400 BC, La Venta was largely abandoned as a major center. The reasons for this shift are complex and remain a subject of ongoing research. Attention then turns to Tres Zapotes, another significant site that persisted beyond the decline of La Venta. Located further west, Tres Zapotes shows evidence of continued occupation into the early Classic period. Unlike San Lorenzo and La Venta, which experienced relatively abrupt declines, Tres Zapotes appears to have undergone a more gradual transformation. This continuity suggests that while the centralized expressions of Olmec culture diminished, populations in the region did not disappear. Instead, they adapted, reorganized, and contributed to the evolving cultural landscape of Mesoamerica. The question of what led to the decline of the Olmec centers has long intrigued archaeologists and historians. Early interpretations sometimes framed the collapse in dramatic terms, attributing it to catastrophic events or sudden invasions. However, more recent research emphasizes the complexity of the process. Rather than a single cause, multiple factors likely interacted over time, reshaping the social, environmental, and economic conditions of the region. Environmental change is one of the most frequently discussed factors. The Gulf Coast's dynamic river systems could alter landscapes significantly over relatively short periods. Flooding might have disrupted agricultural production, while shifts in river channels could affect trade routes and access to resources. Geological evidence suggests that some areas experienced increased sedimentation, which may have impacted settlement viability. Another consideration is resource management. The construction of monumental architecture and the transportation of large stones required substantial labor and coordination. Sustaining such activities over generations would have depended on stable food supplies and social organization. If agricultural yields declined or social cohesion weakened, the capacity to maintain large centers could have diminished. Political dynamics also play a role in many interpretations. The defacement and burial of monuments at both San Lorenzo and La Venta may indicate episodes of internal conflict or changes in leadership structures. Without written records, it is difficult to determine whether these events reflect violent upheaval, ritual renewal, or a combination of both. What can be observed is that the symbolic landscape of these centers underwent significant alteration during periods of transition. Trade networks, which once connected the Olmec to distant regions, may have shifted as well. If alternative centers of influence emerged elsewhere in Mesoamerica, the relative importance of the Gulf Coast could have declined. Such changes would not necessarily result in immediate abandonment but could gradually reduce the flow of goods, ideas, and prestige that supported elite authority. By examining these overlapping factors, environmental variability, resource demands, political change, and shifting networks, scholars attempt to reconstruct a process that unfolded over centuries. The fall of the Olmec civilization, therefore, is not understood as a singular event but as a series of transformations that reconfigured the region's cultural landscape. In the absence of definitive answers, the archaeological record continues to be the primary source of insight. Each excavation, each analysis of soil layers or artifact distribution, contributes to a more detailed understanding of how early complex societies navigated the challenges of their environment and internal dynamics. The story of the Olmec is not one of sudden disappearance, but of change, gradual, multifaceted, and deeply embedded in the broader history of Mesoamerica. As the narrative unfolds further, attention turns to the specific mechanisms behind these transformations, examining how evidence from multiple disciplines, archaeology, geology, and environmental science, helps illuminate the processes that shaped the final centuries of Olmec prominence. As the prominence of La Venta began to wane in the later centuries of the first millennium BCE, the archaeological record reveals a pattern not of abrupt disappearance, but of gradual reconfiguration. The monumental core that once defined the site ceased to expand, and the large-scale construction projects that had required coordinated labor over generations came to an end. Yet the surrounding region did not fall silent. Instead, smaller settlements persisted, and cultural practices associated with the Olmec continued to evolve in new contexts. Understanding this transition requires careful attention to the interplay between environmental conditions, subsistence strategies, and the broader networks in which these communities were embedded. One of the most frequently examined factors in the transformation of Olmec centers is the dynamic nature of the Gulf Coast environment. The region's rivers, particularly the Ka'alkos and Tanala systems, have long histories of shifting courses, depositing sediment, and reshaping the landscape. Geological studies indicate that during the period of Olmec occupation, these processes were especially active. Floodplains expanded and contracted, wetlands shifted, and areas once suitable for agriculture may have become less reliable over time. Archaeological surveys conducted in the vicinity of La Venta suggest that some areas experienced increased waterlogging, which would have posed challenges for maize cultivation. While the Olmec appear to have employed techniques to manage water, such as raised fields or drainage systems, the effectiveness of these strategies would have depended on relatively stable conditions. When environmental variability intensified, the balance between agricultural productivity and settlement sustainability may have been disrupted. Historians and archaeologists debate the extent to which these environmental changes directly contributed to the decline of major centers. Some scholars argue that localized flooding events could have damaged infrastructure and reduced food surpluses, undermining the economic base required to support elite activities and monumental construction. Others caution that communities in the region had long experience adapting to such conditions and that environmental stress alone is unlikely to explain the broader patterns of change. Instead, it is often considered in combination with social and political factors. Evidence from botanical remains and soil analysis provides further insight into subsistence practices during this period. The Olmec diet appears to have relied heavily on maize, supplemented by beans, squash, and a variety of wild resources, including fish and game. Over time, shifts in crop patterns may have occurred, possibly in response to changing environmental conditions or population pressures. If agricultural yields became less predictable, the capacity to sustain large populations concentrated in ceremonial centers would have diminished. At the same time, the organization of labor required to maintain these centers likely depended on complex social structures. The construction of earthen mounds, the carving and transport of basalt monuments, and the arrangement of ritual offerings all point to coordinated efforts directed by a class. The nature of this leadership, however, remains a subject of ongoing research. Without written records, archaeologists infer social hierarchies from burial practices, the distribution of luxury goods, and the scale of architectural projects. Some scholars propose that shifts in leadership structures may have played a significant role in the transformation of Olmec society. The deliberate burial of monuments at La Venta, for example, has been interpreted in multiple ways. One interpretation suggests that new leaders sought to assert authority by symbolically terminating the power of previous regimes, recontextualizing earlier monuments within new ritual frameworks. Another possibility is that these actions were part of cyclical ceremonial practices, marking transitions in cosmological time rather than political upheaval. The available evidence does not allow for a definitive conclusion, and both interpretations remain part of the scholarly discourse. The broader network of interactions across Mesoamerica also appears to have shifted during this period. Olmec-style artifacts, once widely distributed, become less prominent in distant regions after approximately 500 BC. This change may reflect the emergence of new centers of influence, such as those in the Valley of Oaxaca or the Basin of Mexico, where distinct cultural traditions began to develop more independently. As these regions grew in complexity, the relative importance of the Gulf Coast as of exchange may have declined. Trade routes that once facilitated the movement of materials like jade, obsidian, and magnetite could have been redirected or diversified. Such changes would have had implications not only for economic exchange but also for the circulation of ideas and symbols. The Olmec iconographic style, while influential, did not remain static. In later periods, elements of this style appear transformed within different cultural contexts, suggesting processes of adaptation rather than simple transmission. At Tres Zapotes, the archaeological record provides a valuable perspective on continuity and change. Unlike San Lorenzo and La Venta, which experienced more pronounced declines, Tres Zapotes shows evidence of sustained occupation over a longer time. Monumental construction continued, though on a different scale, and new forms of expression emerged. One of the most notable discoveries at the site is Stela C, which bears one of the earliest known long count calendar dates in Mesoamerica. This inscription indicates that while certain aspects of Olmec culture were transforming, other innovations were taking shape that would later become central to civilizations such as the Maya. The presence of the long count calendar at Tres Zapotes has led to discussions about the origins of Mesoamerican calendrical systems. Some scholars argue that the Olmec or related groups played in the early development of these systems, while others suggest a more process involving multiples contributing to shared knowledge. As with many aspects of Olmec history, the evidence supports a range of interpretations rather than a single definitive narrative. The transformation of Olmec centers also invites consideration of demographic changes. Population estimates based on settlement patterns suggest that while large declined, smaller communities remained active across the region. These communities may have reorganized into more decentralized structures, reducing the need for large-scale ceremonial hubs. Such a shift would not necessarily indicate in the sense of societal collapse, but rather in the end scale of social organization. In examining these processes, it is important to distinguish between the decline of specific sites and the of traditions. The term collapse can imply a sudden end, yet the archaeological record in the Gulf Coast suggests a more nuanced picture. Cultural practices associated with the Olmec, artistic motifs, ritual behaviors, and elements of social organization did not disappear entirely. Instead, they were absorbed, transformed, and reinterpreted within new contexts. This perspective aligns with broader patterns observed in ancient societies, where periods often involve both loss and continuity. Monumental architecture may cease, elite structures may, and trade networks may shift, yet everyday life continues and cultural is transmitted across generations. In the case of the Olmec, the legacy of their civilization can be traced not only in that they left behind but also in the traditions that persisted and evolved in subsequent societies. Archaeological methodology plays a crucial role in uncovering these patterns. Advances in techniques such as radiocarbon dating, remote sensing, and paleoenvironmental analysis have allowed researchers to construct more detailed chronologies and to examine the between human and environmental change. For example, the analysis of pollen samples can reveal shifts in vegetation, indicating changes in land use or climate conditions. Similarly, the study of isotopes in soil can provide insights into past hydrological systems. These approaches have contributed to a growing recognition that the transformation of Olmec centers was likely the result of multiple interacting factors rather than a single event. Environmental variability, adjustments, and shifting regional dynamics all appear to have played roles, though their relative remains a matter of ongoing. As attention turns to the later phases of Olmec influence, the focus increasingly shifts from the mu epsilon gamma lambda alpha ceremonial centers to the broader cultural landscape of Mesoamerica. The question is no longer simply why San Lorenzo or La Venta declined, but how the processes observed in these sites contributed to the development of subsequent civilizations. In this sense, the study of the Olmec is not only about understanding an early society in isolation, but about tracing the interactions that shaped the ancient world of Mesoamerica. The evidence suggests that by the time La Venta was largely abandoned, the cultural innovation in the region had begun to diversify. New centers emerged, each with its own trajectories. The traditions associated with the Olmec did not vanish. Rather, they became part of a shared heritage that would be reinterpreted in different forms across time and space. This ongoing process of transformation underscores the importance of viewing the fall of the Olmec not as but as a transition. It reflects the of human societies to adapt to changing circumstances, to reorganize their structures, and to carry forward elements of their cultural identity even as their environments and interactions evolve. The transformation observed at the major Olmec centers invites closer examination of the internal dynamics that may have shaped these changes. While environmental and external factors provide important context, the archaeological record also points to processes unfolding within Olmec society itself. These include shifts in social organization, changes in ritual practice, and possible reconfigurations of authority. Together, they form a complex picture in which decline is not simply imposed from outside, but emerges through internal adaptation and restructuring. One of the most striking features of Olmec sites is the deliberate treatment of monumental art. At both San Lorenzo and La Venta, numerous sculptures were not merely abandoned but carefully buried, fragmented, or repositioned. In some cases, colossal heads were defaced or altered, while other monuments were placed within offerings composed of arranged stones and figurines. These actions appear intentional and structured, suggesting that they held meaning beyond simple destruction. Archaeologists have proposed several interpretations for these patterns. One perspective that such modifications reflect transitions, in which Noon sought to legitimize their authority by transforming or neutralizing symbols associated with regimes. In this view, monuments functioned as embodiments of power, and their alteration signaled shifts in leadership. Another interpretation emphasizes ritual continuity, suggesting that the burial of monuments was part of ceremonial cycles tied to cosmological beliefs. According to this approach, objects were not destroyed but returned to them in acts of renewal, marking transitions in sacred time. The available evidence does not decisively favor one interpretation over the other. Instead, it is possible that both political and ritual factors were intertwined. In many ancient societies, distinctions between governance and religion were not sharply defined. Authority was often expressed through ritual performance, and changes in leadership could be enacted through ceremonial acts. The treatment of monuments in Olmec contexts may therefore reflect a combination of ideological and processes. Burial practices provide additional clues about social organization. Excavations at Venta and other sites have uncovered offerings that include jade ornaments, polished celts, and intricately carved figurines. These items are often associated with high-status individuals or ceremonial contexts, indicating the of social differentiation. However, the distribution of such artifacts is not uniform, and clear evidence of large, elite burial complexes, common in later Mesoamerican civilizations, is relatively limited. This pattern has led some scholars to suggest that Olmec society may have been organized differently from later hierarchical states. Rather than centralized monarchies with clearly defined ruling dynasties, the Olmec may have operated through networks of elite groups whose authority was expressed collectively or through ritual roles. Others argue that the absence of elaborate tombs could be due to preservation issues or the specific environmental conditions of the Gulf Coast, which are not conducive to the survival of organic materials. The question of social structure remains closely tied to the role of ideology in Olmec culture. The artistic and symbolic repertoire of the Olmec is rich with recurring motifs, including human-animal hybrids, supernatural beings, and scenes of transformation. These images are often interpreted as expressions of a cosmological framework in which humans, animals, and deities were interconnected. The figure commonly referred to as the were-jaguar, for example, appears in various forms and has been associated with themes of fertility and rulership. While interpretations of these symbols vary, there is general agreement that they played a central role in legitimizing authority and organizing social ritual practices, possibly involving offerings, processions, and the use of sacred spaces, would have reinforced shared beliefs and reinforced the position of those who mediated between the human and supernatural realms. If changes occurred in these belief systems, whether through internal innovation or external influence, they could have had significant implications for social cohesion. Another dimension of internal change concerns the foundations of Olmec centers. The ability to support large populations and specialized labor depended on the of surplus resources. Archaeological evidence suggests that agriculture was supplemented by fishing, hunting, and the collection of wild plants, creating a diversified subsistence base. However, maintaining surplus production over time would have required careful management of land and water. Some researchers have proposed that intensification of agriculture may have led to soil depletion or other forms of environmental strain. While direct evidence for such processes is limited, the possibility highlights that between human activity and ecological systems. If agricultural productivity declined, even gradually, it could have reduced the of elites to mobilize labor and sustain large scales. Craft production also appears to have been an important aspect of Olmecs. The of jade objects, basalt sculptures, and ceramic goods indicates the of skilled artisans. These items likely held both practical and symbolic value, serving as markers of status and of exchange. Changes in the availability of raw materials or in the demand for such goods could have influenced the organization of production and the of wealth. As regional interactions evolved, the position of Olmec centers within broader networks may have shifted. Evidence from sites outside the Gulf Coast shows that while Olmec-style artifacts were once widespread, later periods exhibit greater regional diversity in artistic and cultural expression. This suggests that other societies were developing their own identities and systems of authority, potentially reducing the influence of traditional Olmec centers. In the highlands of Oaxaca, for instance, early forms of urban organization began to take shape, eventually leading to the rise of Monte Alban. In the basin of Mexico, settlements that would later contribute to the development of Teotihuacan were also emerging. These regions were not isolated. They interacted with the Gulf Coast and may have drawn upon shared traditions while also innovating independently. As these centers grew, they may have attracted trade, population, and cultural prestige away from older hubs like Venta. The concept of shifting cores of influence is important in understanding the broader context. Rather than a single dominating the region indefinitely, Mesoamerica appears to have been characterized by a that rose and fell over time. The Olmec were among the earliest of these, and there provides insight into the processes that would later shape other civilizations. Within this dynamic landscape, the persistence of smaller communities becomes particularly significant. Archaeological surveys indicate that many areas surrounding former Olmec centers remained inhabited, with evidence of continued agricultural activity and local exchange. These communities may have maintained aspects of Olmec culture while also adapting to new. Over time, their traditions would blend with those of neighboring groups, contributing to the diversity of Mesoamerican cultures. The gradual nature of these changes challenges earlier narratives that emphasized sudden collapse. Instead, the evidence points to a prolonged period of transformation, in which different factors interacted at scales. Environmental variability may have affected local conditions, while broader shifts in trade and influenced regional dynamics. Internal processes, including changes in leadership and ideology, shaped how communities responded to these challenges. The study of the Olmec thus becomes an exercise in integrating multiple lines of evidence. Archaeological data must be interpreted alongside environmental records, comparative studies of other societies, and theoretical models of social change. Each perspective offers partial insights, and the challenge lies in constructing a coherent understanding that accounts for the complexity of the evidence. As research continues, new discoveries have the potential to refine or reshape existing interpretations. Advances in remote sensing technologies such as LiDAR have already revealed previously unknown features in Mesoamerican landscapes, suggesting that our understanding of settlement patterns may still be incomplete. Similarly, ongoing of materials and isotopic data may provide more detailed information about diet, mobility, and resource use. In this context, the fall of the Olmec can be seen not as defined by a single cause, but as a multifaceted process that unfolded over centuries. It reflects the interplay of human decisions, environmental, and regional interactions. By examining these processes in detail, scholars seek to move beyond simplified explanations and toward a more nuanced understanding of how early complex societies adapt. The legacy of the Olmec, therefore, is not confined to their monumental remains. It resides in the patterns of interaction, innovation, and adaptation that continued to shape Mesoamerica long after the centers of San Lorenzo and La Venta had ceased to dominate the landscape. By the time the major ceremonial centers of the Gulf Coast had diminished in prominence, the cultural landscape of Mesoamerica was entering a period of increasing regional diversity. What had once been expressed through a relatively cohesive set of artistic motifs and shared practices associated with the Olmec was now being reinterpreted across multiples. This transformation did not occur in isolation. It unfolded through interconnected processes involving migration, exchange, adaptation, and the gradual of new and political configurations. Archaeological evidence from regions beyond the Gulf Coast demonstrates that elements long associated with the Olmec continue to appear, though often in altered forms. In parts of central Mexico, for example, carved stone monuments and ceramic figurines exhibit stylistic features that recall earlier Olmec traditions, yet differ in execution and context. These variations suggest not direct replication, but selective adoption, communities drawing upon familiar symbols while integrating them into evolving local frameworks. In the Valley of Oaxaca, early phases of settlement development reveal increasing complexity. Sites that would later contribute to the formation of Monte Alban began to show signs of, including organized plazas and evidence of activity. While direct links to Gulf Coast centers remain debated, certain iconographic parallels have led some scholars to propose that knowledge and symbolic systems may have circulated between these regions. Others emphasize independent development, noting that similar environmental and social challenges can produce comparable solutions without requiring direct influence. Such debates highlight a broader methodological challenge, distinguishing between diffusion and parallel innovation. The widespread presence of shared motifs, such as depictions of supernatural beings or the use of certain ceremonial layouts, could reflect either direct or convergent development. In the absence of written records, Archaeologists rely on patterns of distribution, material sourcing, and chronological sequencing to assess these possibilities. The resulting interpretations are often probabilistic rather than definitive. The Basin of Mexico offers another case for examining post-Olmec transformations. During the later centuries of the first millennium BCE, settlements in this region began to expand, eventually contributing to the rise of urban centers that would dominate the Classic period. Although the fully developed city of Teotihuacan would not emerge until later, earlier communities already exhibited signs of differentiation and organized construction. Some artifacts from these contexts display stylistic echoes of earlier Gulf Coast traditions, suggesting that ideas continued to circulate even as new took shape. Trade networks remained a crucial through which such interactions occurred. Materials such as obsidian, jade, and marine shells moved across considerable distances, connecting diverse regions. The routes themselves likely shifted over time, influenced by changing political and conditions. As new centers rose, they may have reoriented these networks, altering the of goods and the relationships between communities. In this way, the decline of one could coincide with the emergence of another, reflecting a process of reconfiguration rather than abrupt rupture. Within the Gulf Coast itself, the legacy of Olmec traditions persisted in more localized forms. Sites such as Tres Zapotes and Laguna de los Cerros continue to be occupied, though their roles differed from those of earlier ceremonial hubs. Monumental construction became less frequent, and the scale of public architecture decreased. However, artistic production did not cease. Instead, it adapted, incorporating both inherited motifs and new elements that reflect changing realities. The stelae at Tres Zapotes provide particularly valuable insights into this of transition. Unlike earlier Olmec monuments, which emphasize sculptural forms such as colossal heads and altars, these stelae bear inscriptions and calendrical notations. The presence of long count dates indicates, in the recording of time, one that would later become central to Maya civilization. This suggests that while certain aspects of Olmec expression declined, other forms of intellectual and symbolic innovation were taking shape within the same broad cultural sphere. The emergence of calendrical systems raises important questions about knowledge transmission. Did these systems originate in the Gulf Coast and spread outward, or were they developed independently in multiple regions? Scholars continue to examine the evidence, including the distribution of early inscriptions and the contexts in which they appear. What can be said with some confidence is that by the late first millennium BCE, Mesoamerica was characterized by increasing sophistication in timekeeping, ritual scheduling, and astronomical observation. These developments are often associated with broader changes in social organization. The ability to track time in complex ways suggests that of specialized knowledge holders, individuals or groups responsible for maintaining calendrical systems and interpreting their significance. Such roles would have reinforced social differentiation, even in the absence of large states. In this sense, the transformation of Olmec society may have involved not only a redistribution of population and power, but also a reconfiguration of knowledge systems. Environmental factors continued to shape these processes. Paleoenvironmental studies indicate that the Gulf Coast and surrounding regions experienced fluctuations in climate and hydrology during this period. While not necessarily catastrophic, these changes could have influenced agricultural practices, settlement choices, and resource availability. Communities that adapted effectively would have been better positioned to sustain themselves, while others may have relocated or reorganized in response to shifting conditions. The concept of resilience becomes relevant in this context. Rather than viewing the major Olmec centers as a failure, some scholars interpret it as part of a term process of adaptation. Societies reorganized their structures, diversified their activities, and developed new expressions suited to changing. This perspective emphasizes continuity alongside change, highlighting the of human communities to navigate and evolving environments. It is also important to consider the role of memory and tradition in shaping these transformations. Even as physical monuments were buried or abandoned, the ideas they embodied may have persisted in oral traditions, ritual practices, and symbolic systems. Later Mesoamerican cultures, including the Maya and the peoples of central Mexico, exhibit themes that resonate with earlier Olmec imagery, such as the importance of sacred landscapes, the association between rulers and supernatural forces, and the use of ceremonial centers as focal points of social life. However, caution is necessary when tracing such connections. Similarities in form or theme do not always indicate direct inheritance. Cultural traditions can converge, diverge, and recombine in complex ways. The challenge lies in identifying which elements reflect historical continuity and which arise from independent development within shared environmental and social contexts. As archaeological research advances, the picture of post-Olmec Mesoamerica continues to evolve. Large-scale survey projects have revealed previously unknown settlements, while refined dating techniques have improved chronological resolution. These developments allow for more precise comparisons between regions, shedding light on the timing and nature of culturals. In examining the later phases of Olmec influence, it becomes clear that the notion of a singular end is insufficient. Instead, the evidence points to a of transition during which multiples interacted across different scales. The decline of monumental centers such as La Venta did not mark the disappearance of a people or a culture, but rather a shift in how that culture was expressed and organized. This understanding reframes the question of the Olmec fall. Rather than seeking a single cause, scholars increasingly focus on processes, how environmental variability, social dynamics, and regional interactions combined to reshape the landscape. The result is a more nuanced narrative, one that recognizes both the achievements of the Olmec and the complexity of their transformation. As the final phase of this exploration approaches, attention turns to the broader implications of these findings. What does the story of the Olmec reveal about the early complex societies? How do patterns observed in the Gulf Coast compare with those in other parts of the ancient world? And what lessons can be drawn from a civilization whose legacy endures not in written chronicles, but in the enduring of its interaction with people, landscape, and time? The examination of the Olmec transformation, when placed within a wider comparative framework, offers an opportunity to consider how early complex societies evolve, adapt, and sometimes relinquish the forms that once defined them. Across different regions of the ancient world, similar patterns can be observed, that of centralized ceremonial or centers, the accumulation of symbolic authority, and eventually, a reorganization of these systems in response to shifting internal and external conditions. The Olmec case, grounded in the specific of the Gulf Coast, provides a particularly instructive example of how these processes unfold without clear textual records, relying instead on material traces and environmental. One of the most significant insights derived from Olmec studies is that of flexibility in social organization. The archaeological record does not support the idea of a rigid, lasting, centralized state comparable to later empires. Instead, it suggests of centers that rose and declined over time, each adapting to local circumstances while maintaining certain shared cultural frameworks. This pattern contrasts with models of abrupt collapse and instead emphasizes continuity through transformation. Such flexibility may have been both a strength and a limitation. On one hand, the absence of a highly centralized could have allowed communities to reorganize more readily in response to environmental or changes. Smaller, decentralized groups are often more resilient to localized disruptions, as they are less dependent on a single of failure. On the other hand, the same decentralization may have limited them to coordinate large scales or maintain extensive trade networks over extended periods. The interplay between centralization and decentralization is a recurring theme in the study of ancient societies. In the Olmec context, the peak phases of San Lorenzo and La Venta demonstrate the potential for coordinated labor and symbolic integration. Monumental architecture, standardized artistic motifs, and evidence of long-distance exchange all point to periods in which certain centers achieved a degree of regional influence. Yet these phases were relatively lived when viewed across the full span of Olmec occupation. Environmental context remains central to understanding these dynamics. The Gulf Coast climate, with its high rainfall and frequent flooding, required ongoing adaptation. Agricultural systems had to be managed carefully, and settlement locations needed to account for changing watercourses. Over time, Even small shifts in hydrology could have significant cumulative effects. The of communities to respond to these changes would have depended on knowledge and coordination. Comparative studies with other regions suggest that environmental variability often acts as a stressor rather than a sole cause of transformation. In the absence of social flexibility, such stressors can contribute to rapid decline. However, when combined with adaptive strategies, they may instead lead to reorganization. The Olmec evidence appears to align more closely with the latter scenario. While certain centers declined, the broader population persisted, adjusting settlement patterns and practices. Another dimension concerns the role of ideology and symbolic systems. In many early societies, authority is closely tied to interpret and mediate between the human and supernatural realms. The Olmec artistic tradition, with its emphasis on transformation and the interplay between human and animal forms, suggests a worldview in which boundaries were fluid and interconnected. Such a framework would have influenced not only ritual practices but also social hierarchy and legitimacy. Changes in these symbolic systems can have profound consequences. If the beliefs that underpin authority are challenged or reinterpreted, the structures built upon them may also shift. The modification and burial of monuments at Olmec sites may reflect such, whether driven by internal developments or interactions with neighboring cultures. Over time, new forms of expression emerged, incorporating elements of earlier traditions while adapting them to different contexts. The transmission of knowledge is closely related to these processes. Even in the absence of writing, complex systems of understanding, such as calendrical, astronomical observation, and ritual sequencing, can be maintained and transmitted across generations. The evidence from trace zapotes and other sites indicates that such knowledge did not disappear with the decline of earlier centers. Instead, it evolved, contributing to the intellectual foundations of later Mesoamerican civilizations. This continuity underscores the viewing the Olmec not as an isolated phenomenon, but as part of a term trajectory. Their contributions to art, symbolism, and possibly early systems of timekeeping did not end with each of their major centers. Rather, these elements were integrated into the fabric of subsequent societies, where they were reinterpreted and expanded. At the same time, it is important to avoid overstating the extent of Olmec influence. While certain features appear widely distributed, the development of Mesoamerican civilizations was not the result of a single. Multiple regions contributed to shared traditions, and local innovations played a crucial role in shaping outcomes. The Olmec were one of several early contributors to this process, and their significance lies in the combination of their early and of their interactions. The concept of legacy therefore requires careful definition. It does not imply direct continuity in every aspect, nor does it suggest that later societies simply inherited a fixed set of practices. Instead, it refers to ideas, techniques, and symbolic forms that were available for reinterpretation. The persistence of certain motifs, such as the use of ceremonial centers, the association of rulers with cosmological principles, and the integration of art and ritual, reflects this influence. In considering the broader implications of the Olmec transformation, it becomes clear that the narrative of rise and fall is overly simplistic. The evidence points instead to cycles of dispersal, innovation, and adaptation. These cycles are not unique to the Gulf Coast. They can be observed in parts of the ancient world, from river civilizations to early urban centers in other continents. What distinguishes the Olmec case is the combination of early complexity and the absence of written records, which places greater emphasis on archaeological interpretation. The process of reconstructing this history is ongoing. Each new discovery has the potential to refine existing models or challenge established assumptions. For example, the identification of previously unknown sites through remote sensing technologies has expanded the known extent of Olmec-related, suggesting that the cultural landscape may have been more interconnected than earlier believed. Similarly, advances in scientific analysis continue to provide new data on diet, migration, and environmental conditions. These developments highlight the importance of interdisciplinary approaches. Archaeology, geology, ecology, and anthropology all contribute to a more comprehensive understanding of how societies interact with their surroundings and with each other. In the case of the Olmec, such integration is essential given the limited availability of textual evidence. Ultimately, the transformation of the Olmec civilization reflects a combination of continuity and change that resists simple categorization. Their major centers declined, but their cultural persisted. Their social structures evolved, but did not vanish. Their interactions with the environment presented challenges, but also opportunities for adaptation. By examining these processes in detail, a more balanced and historically grounded understanding emerges, one that moves beyond notions of sudden and instead recognizes that's of long-term development. In reflecting on this history, the focus shifts from seeking definitive answers to appreciating the range of possibilities supported by the evidence. The Olmec case invites a reconsideration of how early societies are understood, emphasizing processes over events and adaptation over. It is within this framework that the final perspective on their transformation can be considered, drawing together of evidence into a coherent historical reflection.